Hello, hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Just give everyone a few minutes to get into the room here before we get started. Hey, everybody, good evening and welcome to the Westdale Cinema's Film Talk series, in which we will be celebrating great Canadian films over the next 5 weeks. My name is Jeff Bender, and before we kick things off tonight, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you've had thoughts or questions for Fred about tonight's feature, there's a Q&A function on your screen. If you wish to grab that and add any comments, any questions, I'll be reviewing those throughout the film and after the film talk to present to Fred. So we look forward to your insights and understanding what your perspectives were on this wonderful Canadian classic. There's a lot to talk about tonight, so we are going to get right to it. And so over to you, Fred. Good evening. Great to see you again.
Yes, good to see you again, Jeff, and I hope you're well, and thank you all for joining. I hope this 8 p.m. Start time was not too confusing and works for people. We just sort of felt that with the warmer weather and the and more daylight, that maybe this is a good thing. But maybe you let us know if obviously you guys are here at 8 o'clock, so we won't know the people who don't like 8 o'clock because they didn't show up. But anyhow, we just thought that would be a thing to try and see how that went. I'm very excited about this series. As you know, we've really been focusing on Hollywood, in the first three with the Film Noir series, and then Academy Award winners, and then screwball comedies, and Canadian films and the Canadian film industry, and what does that even mean, right? Because we're not going to be talking to during this series about people like Norman Jewison or James Cameron or Ivan Reitman, all great Canadian filmmakers, or all the great actors, Jim Carrey. You're not going to see any Ryan Gosling movies, or even Mary Pickford movies, or Keanu Reeves movies. These are all great Canadian, artists working in the film industry. But of course, they all work in Hollywood, and they work on studio films, or, they don't really participate in what we call the Canadian film industry. And the Canadian film industry, as we're defining it for the purpose of this series, really means that these are films that were financed in Canada, primarily got distribution in Canada. Some of them did reach some international distribution as well, but were really made by filmmakers and really artists and photographers and actors who really did not leave Canada, and for various reasons we can talk about as we go through the different films, have stayed here in Canada to make their films. Now, one thing I need to say right at the beginning is you have to understand there are really two industries in Canadian film, and that's, of course, the English language film industry and the French language film industry, and they're completely different. And the French language film industry is a very successful and very, strong industry. And in Quebec, they have big movie stars and, incredible directors, and people go to the movie theaters to see those movies in great numbers, and these films make money. And one of the reasons, besides the fact that they're promoted well and everything else, is, of course, a lot of those filmmakers and actors don't leave. They don't work in English. They don't choose to live in Los Angeles. They want to live in their French Canadian culture. And so the last film is a French Canadian film with Incendie, and we'll talk about that more. But for the most part, we are going to be talking about what I think of as the English language, or, the non-French Canadian film industry. So, again, what is a Canadian film? So, as you know, I'm an American. So when I came here to Canada, and one of my very first jobs was actually working at the CBC. And there was a lot of conversation about Canadian identity, and especially at the CBC, which, as you know, was formed after World War II to try to unify the country and create a common culture, which was hard to do because this is a very vast country. It's a very diverse country. There's a lot of immigration, and of course there's this strong influence of the American culture, because of course most people are watching American television, American movies. So what is this Canadian identity? What is this culture that both at the CBC, and of course they tried to create, and to some extent were quite successful in the early days in the 50s and 60s, and terms of both radio and in television, but what does it mean for film? And are there certain themes we might be able to find within these Canadian films that seem to resonate again and again? And that'll be an interesting thing to look at. And obviously, we're always interested in hearing all your thoughts as well about what does it mean to be not just be a Canadian, but what is your understanding and belief, and how do you think Canadian films represent what is this country and what does it mean? And this is a big topic, obviously, but we'll look at it from a certain lens. Obviously there are also some great Canadian writers who, dominate and are very important in the Canadian television industry. David Shore, for example, the creator of House, Paul Haggis. These are all people we're not really going to be talking about because most of their success, they all started in Canada, but as soon as they achieved some success, it was so easy for them to move down to LA and become successful. And that continues now. So anyhow, we're going to go into this. Now, of course, the reason this Canadian film industry exists at all is because of the federal government, because the federal government does support and finance these independent films. Again, there's no studio in Canada that is able to finance films. There are no Canadian films that are commercially successful on their own. All of them depend on government support. Most of this money is funneled through an organization called Telefilm. Telefilm receives $100 million a year from the federal government, which they then use to give grants to film producers to make the films. And of course, pay for their overhead, which is absurd, of course. Probably 20–25% of the money just goes to pay for their own infrastructure and bureaucracy. There are also the tax credits, of course. You've heard about the tax credits. Those are available to service American films as well. But if you're a Canadian qualified film, you actually get a higher percentage of tax credits than you do if you're just a service. And then, of course, there are requirements that all the broadcasters have to show a certain amount of Canadian content as a condition of license. So for many years, Canadian theatrical films were sort of financed and backstopped by the Canadian pay channels, the Canadian broadcasters, Bell, et cetera, in order to fulfill their license. Now, all of this is a huge issue right now because, of course, they all are constantly trying to lower the requirements for Canadian content because they don't make money. People prefer, on the most part, to watch US content. And because it's better promoted, it's better marketed, it has stars in it, while the Canadian independent films often do not. When it comes to the exhibition of Canadian films, it's even a more difficult problem because there is no requirement from the exhibitors to show Canadian movies. Cineplex Odeon is not regulated by the government. They have no requirement to show any Canadian movies. And for the most part, they don't, right? So it really is the independent cinemas that are, there to hopefully provide and show the Canadian films the way they're meant to be shown in the theater. But of course, there's not a lot of support for that or financing for that. So for the independent exhibitors, it's a problem and a challenge as well. Very big, complicated issue. I just wanted to give you kind of overall insight as to why, this has been such a big challenge for Canadian filmmakers. There's no obvious one solution to it. But on the other hand, we have to be very thankful that the government does support this at all and certainly support the production of the films. They spend a lot of money supporting the production of the films. But from my perspective, they do a terrible job supporting the exhibition of the films. And that's something we're working on. When I say we, there's an organization called NICE, think that's a nice anagram. It's the National Independent Cinema Exhibitors. And this is a brand new organization. We've only formed in the last year or two during the pandemic, and are working to lobby with the government to try to change things. So the 5 films we're going to be showing really try, as usual, we're trying to really show a diverse spectrum of what kind of films are made, and some of the great artists. The first one we'll be talking about tonight, of course, which is The Sweet Hereafter, was directed by Adam Egoyan. And Adam Egoyan is actually one of course, the best Canadian filmmakers. He's a filmmaker who stayed in Canada. He makes his movies in Canada. Once in a while, he's made a commercial film, but almost all of his films are independent films. Then there's Sarah Polley, who, of course, was famous as an actress before she became a director, and who also lives in Canada, never went Hollywood, she certainly could have become a Hollywood, actress and movie star, chose not to take that direction, stayed here, does her work here. We're then going to show a film directed by an Indigenous director, and I may be mispronouncing his name, Zacharias Canuck. Again, you'll help me with pronunciation. I apologize. I believe it's pronounced Atatunk. Do you know, Jeffrey, how to pronounce the title properly? The Fast Runner. Anyhow, this is the greatest Indigenous film that has ever been made in Canada. It's a spectacular film. It did have success around the world. Very, very interesting movie. Guy Madden, again, a national treasurer, never left Winnipeg. Not forget Canada, he never left Winnipeg, but has made some extraordinary films. And then lastly, and we'll be showing My Winnipeg, of course, and then Denis Villeneuve, who is a French-Canadian filmmaker, made fabulous movies here in Canada, and then did go to Hollywood and has made movies like Arrival and Blade Runner, and coming soon, Dune, and is one of the top Hollywood filmmakers. And not quite James Cameron, but really up there in terms of his success. So that's sort of the overview of where we are. So let's get into The Sweet Hereafter. And now I had seen this movie years ago, and I have to say it was one of the saddest and most depressing films I think I'd ever seen. I found it a struggle to get through this movie the first time I watched it. It was in a movie theater, of course, and it was so emotional. And of course, anybody who's lost a child, and here, of course, we see a whole community lose their children. Anybody who's been involved or knows a family situation that had this kind of, that incest as part of it, there's nothing more tragic. And this is tough stuff to watch. But watching it this time, I actually was, just amazed how sophisticated the director was in terms of his treatment. It never becomes, maudlin. It never becomes too sentimental. He's able to, capture a tone, which to me really, touches on these deep emotions and this sort of, the abyss that we can fall into with loss. But he does it in such a way that you also feel the love that is so much, the other side of loss, and that love is so prevalent throughout the film. It really is just amazing how he can navigate that space, of the tragedy, and there's sort of a gentleness that I think he's able to bring to the film, and again with a very unsentimental eye, which I found just, kind of incredible, and Egoyan was only 37 years old when he made this film, but this to me was just a masterpiece in terms of, and we've used this, this word before, tone, right? Where all of the elements, the performances, the visuals, the music, the story itself, all feel just so well integrated and so well balanced that you really feel like you're in the hands of a master, and particularly, of course, in the narrative style itself, and jumping through many different timelines and going back and forth, and the transitions, and we'll get into some more details. this was a very, very accomplished filmmaker. And of course, you know, he was recognized for that. And the film had 2 Academy Awards. He was nominated for Best Director of the Academy Awards and Best Screenwriter for this film, which is not, you know, and this is not a film that had huge success or had a lot of popularity. So that's kind of extraordinary when you really think about it. In fact, it won the 2nd largest prize at Cannes, not the Palme d'Or, but what they call the Grand Prize, which is, again, an incredible feat for a small, low budget, I don't know, it's probably about $4 or $5 million movie. Now, you know, of course, you know, when you think about this, I'll tell you, it's a funny story, but when I first moved to Canada, everybody told me that the most of the great talent of Canada came from either Winnipeg or Newfoundland. And you know, if you really look at it, you'll see that a lot of writers and directors and actors, and certainly a lot of the comedians, as you know, are all from Newfoundland, and you know, the Rick Mercers, Mary Walsh, etc. And I couldn't understand why. And I remember someone trying to explain to me, well, it's so bloody cold and dark there all the time. There's nothing else to do. So you become an abstract thinker. You have a lot of free time to expand your imagination and creativity. And, you know, I don't know. It's kind of a silly explanation, but maybe there's some truth to that. And again, you know, when I think about the tone of this film, and not, oh, by the way, Egoyan was not from either of those places. He actually was born in Egypt and grew up in Western Canada. But there is something about this film that sort of captures something about the, you know, Canada, certainly the way he used the landscape and the power of the Canadian landscape is very evident in this film, and something that, you know, I think you'll see in other Canadian films as well. I tried to think about where else do you see this kind of tonality, and what you know, the obvious place, of course, is in Scandinavia. If you look at, you know, these Scandinavian films, and particularly now the television, you know, Scandinavian noir TV has become, you know, incredibly successful internationally, these sort of bleak crime dramas. And even if you think about literature, you know, you look at some of the great Scandinavian playwrights or novelists, and I see some similarities between, you know, what they're interested in, the themes and the characterizations, and this film, you know, and Canadian films. And I'm curious, you know, again, if others see that or not, and how much, you know, or is that just something I'm just, you know, for the moment, you know, was struck by. But again, what he manages to do here as a filmmaker, and again, you remember this was a book. It was a you know, relatively successful novel by Russell Banks, and you know, it was based on a true incident that took place in Texas. And but Banks sets his story in New York, in upstate New York. But you know, what Egoyan has done here is taken this book, but really made it his own story. He really expanded on it in many ways, and we'll go into some of them specifically. But of course, it's a film. And so as a film, he's able to use images, he's able to use music, he's able to do things that words simply cannot express, right? And create a mood and a feeling that in a book is quite difficult, right? So, you know, as an audience, we get to travel into this kind of very cool and quiet world, and you know, and you know, where love is just bleeding from heartbreak and loss, and we're sort of into it's like there's an emptiness, you know, and we just watch these, you know, broken souls, you know, and weep and feel their pain, and you know, it's just, I just, you know, again, not fun or pleasant, but if you think about filmmaking and what do really filmmakers do, and at least for me, films that really matter are films that speak to the human condition, where, you know, I watch them and maybe I learn something about the human condition, it makes me think about things in my own life and experiences in my own life. And this film, I think, really kind of does this, you know, in an amazing kind of way. You know, again, you know, we talked about the visuals. So let's just talk a little more about Egoyan, just so you get a perspective on this amazing filmmaker. And I had a chance to meet him when I was at the CBC, and we were going to do some television project together. I don't think it actually happened, but he is really a remarkable, not just a film director, but an artist. He's Armenian, and in fact, one of his great films, if you've not seen, you should try to watch, is Ararat. And that's a film about the Armenian genocide. And it's a very powerful movie. He made it later on in his career, but his Armenian heritage was quite important to him, and we'll explain why. But he was originally born in Egypt, grew up in Western Canada. Both his parents were artists, they were painters, and he was certainly encouraged to go into his artistic career. He also has a sister who's quite a well-known classical musician, and then his wife for many years was also Armenian, Arsene Kahanjin, I think is how you say her name. Jeffrey, can you help me with that? Anyhow, she's an actress, and she's in this movie. She plays Wanda. She's the hippie mother, the hippie parents who had the adopted son, Bear. That's actually, Adam's wife. They're no longer married, but it was his wife at the time. And she appears in many of his films. And I think, in fact, it was her connection to her Armenian heritage that really inspired him to do more research and get it, and eventually do this film, Ararat. Many of Adam's films do explore these same themes of sort of alienation and isolation, and and challenges we experience, perhaps defining ourselves in this modern time of technology and bureaucracy and power structure. Almost all his films have this kind of non-linear plot structure, and what that does, of course, is by playing things out of sequence, you're able to sort of, in a way, manipulate the audience and get specific emotional reactions to the scenes you're seeing, but at the same time, you're withholding key information. So, for example, when we see, Ian Holm, Matthew, on the plane, talking to this girl who he finds out he actually knows and was a friend of his daughter, Zoe's, it's 2 years later, right? But we're getting information, early in the movie that we don't even really know what to make of it, because it's not integrated into the narrative flow. If all those scenes, and there are 5 scenes that take place in the airplane, if those had just been done at the end of the movie, they just wouldn't have had anywhere near the power or the resonance that they do. Egoyan also, of course, has directed theater. He's directed opera. He actually started a cinema in 2004. He opened something called Camera Bar, which was this very cool 50-seat sort of cinema lounge on Queen Street West. I don't think it was terribly successful, exists anymore. But this is a man who really has committed himself to the Canadian industry and has done, just wonderful things in supporting other Canadian artists, sometimes executive producing films, teaching at the Canadian Film Center, all those kinds of things. This is, the film that got him attention before this was a film called Exotica, very interesting kind of film, some similar themes. Many of the same actors actually worked on that, but this was really the film that got him his attention. And as I mentioned, it won the grand prize at the Cannes and the Academy Award nominations and all that kind of stuff, So very, very accomplished and wonderful filmmaker. He ultimately did try to make a sort of a studio movie. It was kind of a thriller called Chloe. This was his chance to do something, maybe perhaps more commercial. And it was his most commercial film, but ultimately not terribly successful. But he's done a few other, films since then that have gotten attention. And he did, work with another thriller, Remember, with Christopher Plummer. Anyhow, I certainly recommend you watching, other films of his. I do think he's an absolutely extraordinary director and someone important. Now, again, what he did to make this film particularly successful, in my mind, Well, there are many different elements, but let's start, for example, with the music, because I think this is absolutely an extraordinary music score, and the way he uses the music is very important. The score was done by a composer named Michael Dana, one of our greatest composers. He works on Canadian projects. I actually worked with him on a television series called Camelot, but he also does a lot of great movies in Hollywood. He's one of Ang Lee's favorite composers. He did the score for Life of Pi and some really important Hollywood movies as well. And one of the most extraordinary things about Michael is he really likes to experiment with orchestration and the use of instrumentation to do his music. And we see many different expressions of how he does music in here that I think is really important. One of the big story changes that didn't exist in the book, well, there were two major ones. The first one is that in the book, the story is told by multiple characters. We actually have different kind of points of view as the story proceeds. Here, we pretty much tell the story from the lawyer, Ian Holm's point of view. We're pretty much with him, experiencing the story. There are scenes that he's not in, but it's really his view that we follow almost all the time. The second big change was the introduction of and references to the story of the Pied Piper of Hemblen. That was not in the book. That was completely added by Adam, and I think was done incredibly well, and kind of brings this whole story into sort of a more of a mythological and almost spiritual level that maybe the book didn't quite achieve because it didn't have that element, and is done very well here. And I think it also kind of helped create this sort of sense of otherworldliness, where this isn't just happening here in this town, and it's not sort of a gritty, realistic presentation of a town. It really becomes, like a fairy tale, like, the Pied Piper itself. Actually, the Pied Piper was not a fairy tale. As you know, it was a poem written by Robert Browning in verse, and an absolutely brilliant poem. And I think, again, how that was presented was quite wonderful. So those were some of the big changes. But of course, if you notice, right from the very beginning, the score is not contemporary instrumentation. We're listening to medieval instruments performing this score, including a Persian flute, which is, not something you normally hear in movies. But from the very beginning, and I'm sure, I don't know this for a fact, but the fact that the Pied Piper was going to ultimately be an important part of this story may have encouraged this idea to have some of the score, not all of it obviously, but some of the score presented through these kind of medieval instrumentation, which again, from the very beginning, you kind of, like, wait a second, what's going on? Where are we? We're not, this isn't a period piece. Why are we hearing these strange instruments? Why, what is this all going to mean? Why is this about, right? So, interesting how movies, get changed and books get changed. Actually, the way he found this book was kind of interesting, because his wife, turned him on to it. You hear this story again and again about wives introducing, filmmakers to material. But she introduced the book to him, and the book had been optioned, and a studio was trying to produce it, and never kind of happened. But he managed to, and Adam Egoyan was not a well-known filmmaker, but he was friends with the novelist Margaret Atwood. And it was Margaret Atwood who actually, introduced him to banks and kind of, helped broker the deal that allowed Egoyan to get the rights. And Egoyan says he was drawn to the novel right away because he's always interested in confronting the most extreme things. And this was sort of a book about, he's confronting a very extreme thing, obviously, right? What were some of the other changes that were really important? A very important one, obviously, was the character of Dolores, the bus driver, right? Because in the book, she's not kind of as important a character and as critical to what actually happens. And here, again, the storytelling is just so interesting, how we see Dolores through different different aspects from the very beginning when she's taking the kids to the fair, etc. And then later on to the very end, where, after all of this, she's she's driving the shuttle bus at the airport. We really have a journey with her that wasn't in the book at all, right? But again, also he increased the importance of the lawyer, as we said, Mitchell Stevens, and also Mitchell Stevens' relationship with his daughter, with Zoe, and that's obviously playing as a parallel to what's going on in the town, and helps us perhaps understand and helps amplify, what the lawyer's going through. It was in the book, but certainly not to the same level as it is in the film. And I think that's very powerful. Interestingly, the character of Zoe was actually played by Russell Banks' daughter, who is not a famous actress or anything, but I think, and again, doesn't have a huge part of the film, but I think, again, did very well, in this. What else can we say? The music, again, Sarah Polley sings. She's not obviously known as a singer, but Nicole is an aspiring singer. We see this very first song, of course, that she's performing. Michael Dana wrote the song. Sarah Polley wrote the lyrics for some of these original songs, and then, of course, they also use the fantastic Tragically Hip song called Courage that both they perform, and then later on we hear the song at a very critical point in the film, and it works very well. So integrating things like Tragically Hip, obviously the great Canadian band, very interesting, and again, using the music and Sarah Polley, involvement, not just as an actress, but also in the music, I think is just absolutely, really works incredibly well. This is a film, to me, that could so easily have gone over the top in terms of milking our emotions and really, kind of manipulating us. And often filmmakers do that. And here I never felt that way. I never felt it was done to excess. It was never done in such a way to sort of just, exploit us as an audience. The acting is just amazing. And now, of course, believe it or not, Ian Holm was not supposed to be in this film. You could guess, but the star of this film was Donald Sutherland, of course, the great Canadian actor. And I'm sure you can imagine Donald Sutherland playing in that role. And not completely sure what happened and why he ultimately fell out, but it was only like 2 weeks before they started shooting, and they brought Ian Holm in instead. And personally, I think that may have been very fortunate, because as much as I admire Donald Sutherland, he's a fantastic actor, Donald may have been a bit too big for this part. And he's quite a, showy actor in a way, and quite expressive. And of course, also just his size as a human being. And maybe it would have been too much for that part. And Ian, of course, who's, quite small in stature and very contained and very kind of internal in terms of his performance and the subtlety of his acting, may have even been better, and there's something so compassionate about him, and he can still be menacing and, dangerous. I actually did a movie with Ian Holm, a very strange movie called Beautiful Joe, with Sharon Stone and Billy Connolly and Ian Holm, talking about strange casts. And he is one of the nicest and most professional men I've ever met in my life. And of course, because being British, he grew up and was educated in the British theater system. Sir Ian Holm. This began with the Royal Shakespeare Company, very successful theatrical career, did one of the greatest King Lears of all time. He won a Tony for a film called The Homecoming, Harold Pinter's great play. Lots of wonderful support. Of course, you might remember him from Chariots of Fire, and he was an Alien. Remember, he played Ash in Brazil and The Fifth Element, and people also know him, of course, from The Lord of the Rings, because he was, Bilbo Baggins, right? And The Hobbit and Bill, in those series. So, not a huge movie star, obviously, but incredibly talented, incredibly successful actor. And he took on this part in this small little Canadian film because he says, he was 65. Nobody ever offers me a leading role. So, this is kind of unusual to have a leading role offered to him. And he took it and I think was quite wonderful in it. As I mentioned before, Zoe was played by Russell's daughter, Caerthan Banks. Sarah Polley. Now, we're going to be talking about Sarah Polley quite a bit in our next film, Away From Her, which she wrote and directed. Perhaps many of you might remember her as a great child actress. She starred, in that great kids series called Ramona, based on the Beverly Cleary books, and of course, a very well-loved Canadian television called a series Road to Avonlea, which was, I believe, the successor to Anne of Green Gables. So she was, from very young age, super talented actress. Her technique, her capacity, and very much on display here. I'm not sure exactly how old she was at the time. I think a little older than the character, but still quite young. And she had been in Exotica, so Adam knew her. And she's went on to do, a bunch of other movies, but of course, she never really, and certainly did have the opportunity to go to Hollywood and become kind of, a Hollywood film star, and more like, the way Rachel McAdam, another, great Canadian, actress, kind of did a few films here, went to Hollywood, had a great career. And then, of course, later on, Sarah turned towards screenwriting and directing and has done a number of movies, but we'll be talking about Away From Her. The rest of the cast is absolutely made out of the most exceptional character actors in Canada, and there have always been great actors in Canada. Many of them, of course, get most of their experience from Stratford, and the Stratford, sort of, the various plays that go on there for years, and they are extraordinary actors. In fact, I did a TV movie in Canada called The Pied Piper of Hemblen, based on this famous play. And we happened to shoot it in Canada. It's a long, complicated story, but the Pied Piper was played by Eric Idle, and the rest of the cast all came from Stratford. And I got to meet a lot of these actors, and they were, this was, back in 1985 or something like that. But, some of the people here you probably have seen before, though many of them do more theater than they do film. Tom McCamus, who plays Nicole's father, fantastic actor, many great stage performances. From Winnipeg, of course. I'm not sure what you may have seen or remembered him from, but he's a regular and done lots of great Stratford starring performances. Gabriel Rose, who plays the Dolores, the bus driver. What a great Canadian character. The accent, the hair, the earmuffs. Really wonderful moments. Her grandfather was a great actor. His father was an actor. She actually trained in England, but came back here. Many Egoyan movies, and and again, wonderful. Alberta Watson, who plays Risa, who was the first couple that she meets, and who's having the affair. You've seen her on TV probably in Femme Nikita. She was one of the stars. And she's also, you'll see her in Away From Her. Maury Chaikin, another wonderful character actor who played Wendell. Stephanie Morgenstern, who played Allison. That's the friend that the lawyer meets on the airplane, actually became a great writer and director. And she's created some wonderful Canadian TV series, including Flashpoint and other things like that. So, and then of course, Adam's wife, who played Wanda. Simon Baker, who's the little kid, plays Bear, actually grew up to be a very successful, one of the most successful Indigenous actors. He starred in a miniseries called Into the West, and he was in The Missing, and, he's been so. And then, of course, Bruce Greenwood, who's one of my favorite Canadian actors. And of course, Bruce has been in lots of Hollywood movies and, played John F. Kennedy and, Captain Pike in Star Trek. And, you've seen him all over the place in American television lots of times, of course. And here, playing Billy, right, the man who had lost his wife and then loses his two kids. I just think he just kind of has this quality that I really see so much as sort of a Canadian character, with the big mustache and this kind of, big, not violent guy, but, strong emotions. Someone who is iconoclastic. He believes in what he believes. He's not, of course, as from a narrative point of view, he's a critical character because he's the one who rejects the lawyer and actually tries very hard to convince everybody not to go forward with a lawsuit, because of course he recognizes what very few others do, except Nicole, which is that. Sure, there was this tragedy and these that we lost all of these wonderful children, but even a greater tragedy is now occurring, which is how this community is being kind of not corrupted, but being led down this path by this lawyer to seek revenge, to, as he often says, to let me be the voice of your anger, and that somehow by getting all this money, which of course the lawyer is going to keep a third of it all, it's going to somehow make things better. And instead, what appears to be happening is it's making things worse. It's just kind of turning the community against each other. It's channeling their loss into, emotions of greed and a desire for money. And so, it's a very kind of, I found that really fascinating, and how this this incident is actually kind of having these repercussions, and in many ways is going to kind of destroy this community, until, of course, the twist at the end, which I don't think anybody, really was expecting. So fantastic actors all along. Again, Ian Holm, what an incredible character, right? He, because he's complex, and, on one hand is he just a vulture? Is he just preying on the weak and, trying to take advantage of them? And is it just all greed, or is it something more? Is he haunted by this daughter he's lost to heroin, and he's somehow, dealing with that loss through this, this surrogacy of this lawsuit, right? And so he's sort of full of this rage, and but again, he can be, the shyster, he can perform, and he tries to, you see him manipulate his pitch to suit the emotional needs of each of the clients, and it's different for each one, and and how he tries to get them to come along, and anyhow, and then of course, when we see him confronted with his own daughter, and even with this, horrific news that she's, she has HIV, he's just, he's turned to ice. He's incapable of any kind of action. And then, of course, we hear this amazing story about what happened when, when Zoe was a little girl and she almost died, and, and the bug bite in the pen and the drive in the car, and really incredible stuff in my mind, and none of it again feels sort of superfluous or just added on just to milk. It all is integrated into our story, and again, how and when these different story points are revealed is incredibly interesting. The photography, Paul Sarasi, again, great Canadian photographer, just so beautiful how you juxtaposing, the town against the mountains, and the power of the mountains and the snow. Incredible helicopter shots. Remember the little drones in those days, the way the bus is used as an image multiple times throughout the story in its different, incarnations, both before and after the accident. I think the editing is quite extraordinary in this film. The transitions, many times you see transitions where, we're jumping through timelines, and we're sort of either panning up to the sky, and there's always kind of this otherworldly quality that brings us into this, again, sensation that this isn't just kind of a TV movie that, there's sort of I don't know if mythology is the right word. I'm not, but it's something that's really telling us that this is, a fairy tale in its own right. It's not the Pied Piper, but it is a fairy tale of sorts, right? Again, since it's out of time, when we go back through the film and when we see the children climbing aboard the bus, and who never come back, and knowing what's going to happen, and again dying, except for the two who survived, the bus driver and the teenage girl, but who are just broken people, and absolutely amazing. And then of course, when we actually see the event, we don't really even see the event. We see the bus kind of leave the road. We see it sitting on this lake, which is obviously a CGI shot, but very, very well done for its time. But we don't see anybody drowning. We don't see how people are saved. We don't. It's just wonderful, I think, that there's not a lot of, as much as the entire movie is about this incident, the incident itself is so underplayed. It's not something that that the audience has to go through in terms of the visual experience of it, but we go through with all the emotional consequences of what happened along the way, right? Again, who's the villain here, right? Is the lawyer the villain? Not exactly. I don't know. That's again why I think the film is so wonderful, because there's no really good guy or bad guy. Is Billy the hero? Not really. Is Nicole the hero because of what she does and says at the end? I'm not sure, and that's why I think it makes it so interesting, and that there's kind of this sophistication in terms of how the characters are all presented. Nicole's story is just amazing to me. I very, very much remember the first time I watched this film. And of course, the incest is really hinted at from the very beginning, when she's performing on stage and this older man is watching her and you're trying to figure out, well, this can't be her boyfriend, but he's looking at her lovingly. And then she calls him dad, and they're sort of sitting together, but with an intimacy that seems odd. And then, of course, that incredible sequence, with the candles, and, we really are told very explicitly what's going on in terms of their ancestral relationship. But even then, again, I just think Sarah's so brilliant, this film. You just look at her face and, her eyes and, and her capacity to show emotion and, deep, really, we get inside that character. But still, I don't think it was a calculated or planned idea. But in the final deposition, of course, when she basically lies and, says things that weren't true, that it was Dolores' fault because she was driving too fast, which was not necessarily true, but basically, ruins the whole lawsuit. And she basically does it to, to say fuck you to her father. This is her revenge, for being abused and taken advantage of by this guy. And because she's seen what's happened to him and how this is all about the money and revenge, for him. And it's not really about her at all, and she's not getting her legs back. She's not going to learn how to walk again. Really very powerful ending to me. And I didn't see it coming the first time. I'm curious again for you guys, maybe who watch this for the first time, how you felt about this incest story and how this kind of worked or didn't work for you. The film, of course, was shot in British Columbia, but also in Ontario. Brilliantly set there. Very, very fast shooting schedule, of course, because there was no money, but very important that, Egoyan had this familiar cast. You've heard this theme before, where actors use the same cast members again and again and again, like Francis Coppola, et cetera, because they can really trust each other. They can move quickly. It's, as Egoyan says, when you're working on a limited production schedule, it's a comfort to know that the personalities involved, what they need as an actor, as opposed to having to discover that and be surprised by that. So he really was able to get what I think are great performances and do it in a very, very quick amount of time. The Pied Piper of Hemblen, we've talked about that and how that, so again, what can I say? I think it's like, Egoyan's like, he's like a great conductor. He's conducting the ensemble actors and the photography and the music, and it's so intricately written, and then sort of the ambiguities, in the story and in the characters. It gives this film kind of a timelessness. I don't even know. I mean, when is this? Is this the 90s? It could be 5 years ago. It could have been, 1950. It doesn't really matter, And again, Egoyan, I think of him as sort of a humanist, right? That he's not sensationalizing the tragedy, and he's really trying to create empathy for all the characters involved, and allow us to kind of really become quite intimate with these characters and with these this community, right? So anyhow, look, I could go on and on. I'm just trying to think, again, pretty good reception for the film. He didn't win the Academy Award for Best Director. Another Canadian won, James Cameron, because that was the year of Titanic. And he didn't win for Best Screenplay because that year Curtis Hanson won for a film called LA Confidential. Anyhow, why don't we look at some slides and talk a little bit about the images, and then of course looking forward to hearing your questions. So please, Jeffrey, let's go ahead. Okay, so here we start, of course, with this fabulous image from the very beginning, the opening credits. And what are we looking at? We don't know who these people are. And it takes a long time before we actually understand that that is the lawyer and his wife, and of course his baby Zoe. And this is probably just before, she's bitten. But it's a very striking image, right? It's offset, it's an angle, nobody's looking at the camera, everybody's looking away. We don't really know what is going on here other than this kind of intimacy. They're all naked, they're all exposed. Very powerful, interesting image, and very provocative, I guess I would say, because we don't know what it is. Next one. In the car wash, this was very amusing, actually, that he's trying to talk on the phone, he's stuck in a car wash. But then, this image at the end, as he leaves the car wash, as he goes off into the light, it's very powerful. And again, kind of gives you immediately a sense we're not just going to be in a traditional TV movie kind of landscape. Next image, the country fair. Again, this becomes, a scene we revisit again and again. Here, Nicole is practicing with her band. Very, very interesting. Again, beautiful image with the reflection and the water. And of course, we see ultimately, her father watching, and we get introduced to that. I thought it was very interesting, the little mural in the background, which appears to be her. I'm not really sure what that is, but very interesting, the dual images facing out, maybe this is some kind of little subtle indication that there's more to this character ultimately than we think. Next image.
Just to interject on that image, if you recall, Mrs. Otto is she's an artist, and you start to see more of her art later on, which is exactly what this is. So I think what it does is it gives you a little sense of community that everyone's.
That's right. Oh, that's right. You're absolutely right. So the community is already being established. Very brilliantly added on there. What's next? And then, of course, the bus. This is, again, aftermath. This is, the lawyer seeing this broken husk of a bus, ultimately an important character in the film. We see it in many different incarnations. Interesting, again, the way he's looking at it through the window, the way it's broken by the frame of the window frame, the red tape, the snow. Very, very interesting image, just a powerful image on its own. Next. Yeah, and then, of course, we start the hotel set against the mountain, something a wonderful job in this film establishing the community in this small town and what life there is like. Next, please. Yeah, so he comes in and he meets Risa, Maury Chaikin. He starts to explain why he's there. We start to understand the story. It's a very clever little scene because we get to learn about many of the characters. They start talking about the different characters and who live in the town, and don't talk to them, they're stupid, and those people went to college. And so in a very succinct way, we get a lot of just traditional exposition out of the way in this scene, which I thought was very clever. Next. Where are we? We're on this airplane. I don't know. It takes a while to figure out, oh, this is 2 years later. And, who's this girl that, and he forgets that her father was his partner and that she used to come and hang out in the house. And, who is this cat? What's happened to him that he lives in such a state of confusion or hiding something? And very interesting. And of course, ultimately, he tells her this story. We come back to this 5 times, very, very interesting use of, again, storytelling and structure. Next. Yeah, so, this is just so sad because, we watch the bus go around and pick up these kids. And I forget what Dolores says. It's like, picking up berries, as they all run to the, and she obviously has such affection for these children. And of course, here we have, them waving goodbye to Bear, and never to see him again. And it's just so interesting because, of course, we know this. Nobody else, the people in the film don't know this. They don't know what's about to happen. So there's sort of all this heightened emotion to what otherwise could have been kind of a mundane scene. Next. Yeah, and there's Dolores, and how incredible the wall, the pictures of all the children, and she's just an enigma, with that strange hair and glasses, and what is going on in this woman? I mean, was it her fault, the guilt? I mean, we never really found out how she survived or anything like that, but it doesn't matter. She's just, in this kind of, it's just very odd to me, how she speaks, her affect, and then ultimately, we see her at the end as if somehow absolved. I can't quite explain this character, so I don't really know, but I found it intriguing. Next. Yeah, beautiful shot again, with Ian looking in the mirror, and what an incredible look and eyes and hands. And we've talked before, the eyes are the window to the actor's soul, and it just seems like there's so much going on inside this character, and layers of depth, and again, different ways he acts in different sequences. This is a very kind of intimate moment. I thought it was very powerful. Next. Yeah, here he is, trying to convince these parents to join. He's actually on his knees, crawling, begging, please, I need you, I'm gonna be the savior. I'm gonna get you all this money, and he becomes almost like this, slick salesman trying to convince them that, that this is gonna somehow make things better. I mean, really interesting performance. And again, this is where Ian and his physical, I don't see Donald Sutherland performing the scene this way, so it really worked. And I think something about his stature, just his physical stature really makes this scene and this character come alive, but who knows. Next.
I'd like to interject too that the moment that the Ottos agree to look at the paperwork, there's this great moment where he runs from the house to get this paperwork
with joy, yeah, with glee, yeah. Next. So this is, of course, that wonderful scene where Nicole is babysitting Billy's kids and reads them the Pied Piper, and beautifully, and then there's this very affectionate. Can you go back for a second? Whoops. Very affectionate moment. She, kisses them both goodnight, and it just really, we embrace her and fall in love with her, and we kind of have a sense where this Pied Piper story is going, but of course it continues to evolve. Next one, please. Yeah, so I don't know what to say. Thank God we didn't have to see them take their clothes off or kiss or anything like that. I think that would have just been way too much, but so sick, with the candles and, trying to, I just, I have 4 daughters. Very difficult for me to watch this stuff. Next scene. Again, the beautiful bleak landscape, the little bus against this huge, powerful landscape. Feels like, it goes on forever, the power of that versus sort of the insignificance of us small human beings, this one small bus against this grandeur and sort of foreboding and, isolation and all these things that these kinds of images evoke in us, right? Next. Yeah, here's the bus arriving, picking up kids along the way. Next. Again, this is that famous CGI shot, the one moment of the accident itself. We see the bus, start to slowly, go into the water. Again, no close-ups, all done in this big long shot, insignificant little bus, but full of humanity against this landscape. Next. Again, Zoe is the little girl. I just can't even imagine, I don't know if any of you, I had a daughter who was very sick and when she was born and we had all sorts of tragedies, but here he is trying to be calm and taking her to the hospital with the knife ready to, do a tracheotomy, on this little daughter. Wow, that's powerful stuff. Next. Yeah, and then here's Bruce Greenwood, Billy, kind of watching the incident and, the hat. I don't know. This is to me, this is a Canadian persona, that we've seen many times in both film and TV and literature. But I think Bruce Greenwood did a great job in creating this character. Next.
Just to remind everyone too that scene where the mother is throwing Zoe up into the air, and the camera rises to the sky, it dissolves into this very shot.
And then it comes back to this. Yeah. These transitions are fantastic. Again, the editor, Suzanne Shipton, did a really great job. Next. Yeah, so this is, kind of at the end, as where, the lawyer is, videoing the wrecked bus, and he meets Billy, and Billy makes it very clear his hatred, and he's just going to beat the crap out of the lawyer, and this is a very tense, dramatic scene, very well acted, and again, ultimately, neither of them really become the protagonist who actually changes, the narrative flow. That really is Nicole, but the conflict of these two characters is very strong here, and very, very well done scene. Next. Yeah, just another fantastic image, isn't that? That's, of course, Zoe, in the phone booth, about to tell her father she's been diagnosed with HIV, isolated in this little box against all of this, human creation, very different and contrasting, of course, with the landscapes and the mountains, but it sort of has a similar impact of making us feel this tiny human and its insignificance against, but instead of nature, what man has created and our technology has created with this bizarre, landscape of cement and concrete, Next. And this was really bizarre how, we actually never really saw Zoe in close-ups. Often she's shot in wide shots. And then suddenly we're in this extreme close-up of both her and of the lawyer and of Ian, her father, and which just, brings another level of drama to this incredibly powerful, intimate moment of her revealing that, whether, I don't know whether she's going to die or not, but that she has HIV, which, remember, in 97 was, like a death sentence, right? Next. Yeah, and this is again, cutting to this shot, and that's, using extreme close-ups like this is very unusual, and again, never really done in this film, except for this one moment. So the power of it is even greater because of it. Next. Yeah, so, here's they're, getting ready and, for this deposition. And And again, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. Nicole obviously has told him, I'm going to tell the truth. And then, of course, she doesn't tell the truth. So at what point did she decide what she was going to do, and when? It really isn't really tipped off. We really don't know what's about to happen. So I found this kind of the mystery of the plot very interesting at this point, not feeling very unsettled and not knowing what was going to happen next. Yeah, and then here we are at the end. Dolores is there, greeting people, because I don't know. One way, I almost felt sorry for Dolores, because you could jokingly say, Nicole threw her under the bus and she was going to wind up in jail, or something horrible would happen to her if it was that she was the one who caused this accident. But somehow that didn't happen, and she's kind of just still has a job as a bus driver, which is almost incomprehensible. But here she is, and smiling, and her life, obviously, complicated characters, is all perhaps a facade and emotionally quite broken inside, but nevertheless, here she is. And so I wouldn't say it's a happy ending, but it gives resolution to the story and to her character in a very nice way, I thought, and not easy to do. How are you going to wrap these characters up, and at the end, and he does it very, in a very succinct way. And any more? Next. Oh yeah, of course, I love the shot of, now we have the bus, at the end, it's just kind of floating in air. I'm not even sure why, but they have it on a crane and they're lifting it up in the air. And just before that, you see Billy, standing in front of the bus as it's being pulled up into the air. But, again, it gives it kind of a magical, quality to this bus. And, it doesn't really mean anything, I don't think, per se, but it just is very evocative image that kind of remains with you. Again, I always think about a film and what happens after the movie is over. What do I remember about them? Do I even think about the film the next day or not? Are there image for the films that stay with me and I remember, the next day or a few days later? And to me, that's the success of a film, when it's actually had an impact on you, where it's not something you just sort of ate and, and just that was good, and the next day you don't even think about it again. So, a great film like this film, I think, is something that resonates with you and stays with you, and maybe you have to think about, and maybe images. And this was certainly an image that I remembered and was interested to see again. Next. Yeah, and then here we go. This is the end, and it's a very interesting, expression she has. And again, against sort of a fantastical background of the fair. And, is she happy? Does she feel, that somehow she's gotten revenge and satisfied because of that? Or, it's much more complicated, right? And of course, with the poem, the lame boy who, was left behind, here's our lame girl, it's so literal in a way, but obviously works, in terms of the structure of the story, who doesn't go through and to the mountain and is left behind with her community and has to, live in the sweet hereafter, right? As the story goes. One more or no? Yeah, that's it. So anyhow, love to hear you. I'm sorry I took so much time, but I just, as you can see, this is a film that I think really deserves that kind of appreciation, but love to hear some questions. So what do we got, Jeffrey? Do you have any comments or questions you'd like to add first?
I have a question for you, and I was wondering, and maybe also for our audience as well, and that's that moment when Stevens is confronting Billy at the bus, and he starts to almost have a monologue about his daughter and about how, he also has loss. And it's a powerful scene in that it almost seems manipulative. Why is he telling Billy this? But then it turns into something else entirely, I find. I'm just wondering what you thought of that.
I think so, but basically, again, this is the many faces of, of Stevens, and Ian Holm so we don't really know exactly who this guy is, because every, different scenes, he takes on a different persona depending on who he's talking to. So you're absolutely right. At the beginning of the scene, we go, okay, here he is trying to manipulate Billy because he needs Billy to come along and not fight him on this thing. And then, of course, it does seem to go to a deeper, more, emotional level where he's really pouring his heart out. But I don't know. Or is that all still part of his manipulation and trying to get Billy to, to come along by creating this, this empathy for him and his great loss and and my daughter and all this kind of stuff. And I understand that. So I think, again, that's when scenes are interesting, when they're working on multiple levels and it's not, crystal clear exactly what's going on. So I don't know. I mean, for me, that, the ambiguity of it was kind of what made it so powerful.
Well, thanks, Frank. Fred, the Jeff Duncanson also wanted to mention, because this is that last shot of Sarah is not the final shot in the film. No. She's actually telling, wrapping up the story. And as he mentions, the image of going into the bright light is used both in the car wash and at the very end of the film with Nicole, as she can see the lights of Billy presumably coming home after his affair with Riza.
Yeah.
So it's well positioned.
Yeah. No, again, really beautiful visual images to support the story and the emotions. I completely agree. Yeah, it was not the last image. You're right.
David Striner mentioned Billy was following the bus, so would have known the bus wasn't going 72 miles per hour. He could have told the truth, but didn't want the lawsuit to go forward.
Yeah, I guess so. But, after that testimony, and I was watching the speedometer and I saw, who's gonna argue with this girl, So you're right, he could have, but he didn't want it to go through anyhow. So, he wasn't going to say anything,
Michael Claes' thoughts on Nicole's motivation is that she's not just hurting her father, but she's taking Billy's side against her father. She knows Billy and she overheard him arguing against the lawsuit.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's also true. I think deeply, and it wasn't really just her father. I think she's seen the impact on the whole community and how the divisiveness that it's created, this greed, which was never kind of, part of these people or, something. And again, the Pied Piper in a way was the lawyer too, right? Because he's the one who's sort of bringing these folks along into this fantasy of they'll be rich and, if they follow him. So, it's not just the bus driver. There are many Pied Pipers. But I agree. I think that it wasn't just revenge for the incest. There was more to her decision than just that. That would be simplifying it. Yeah. Right. Good question.
Were you able to pick up, as you were watching the film, those cuts to the airplane and where they fit in the film? Is there a reason why we keep going to the plane at certain points in the film, do you think?
Again, I haven't read the screenplay. It would be very interesting to see how closely the script followed the final cutting of the film. Often they do not, right? Particularly films like this. And it would be interesting to see because obviously they shot, all the scenes as one, in one day, and then how they decided to break it up and when to cut to these scenes on the airplane. My intuition is probably wasn't exactly the way it was written in the script. And it was something that they found that rhythm later on. But again, I think each time it seemed to make sense. There was a reason why they were going at that point to, again, tell us more about Stevens, tell us more about, his character and elicit a certain kind of, and again, give us information that we didn't have before, right?
Well, and I really feel like this use of editing, it recalls the way grief occurs in the sense that, you're living your life, but then the memories flood in out of nowhere and it's truncated and it's not linear.
Well, and it also feels like a dream, because this is what our dreams are like, right? Our dreams are never really linear, right? We jump around, images appear in our dreams that don't necessarily belong with each other and how they juxtapose. And so, the way our subconscious works is more like this, than what we think is reality, which is this very straightforward, linear, time, going. That's not really how our minds work. I'm not even sure that's really the nature of reality at all. So I do agree with you that this, by doing and using this kind of structure, it does create this timeless sort of fantastic experience for you as an audience that puts you in perhaps a more of a dreamlike state, as a way of, another metaphor for what he's managed to do here, and brings and adds a lot of power to this film. And why we feel, again, the Sweet Hereafter, it's a very strange title when you think about it in some ways, because what's so sweet about this hereafter, right? Who's happy anymore? And, and the people who died, well, we don't really, there's no comment on what happens to them, and, if it's good, bad, or nothing, but it's all kind of creating this very kind of fairy tale-like, very subjective and therefore very emotional experience. So
a few more questions, Fred, if we have time to pose to you.
Yeah, we should wrap up. Yeah,
exactly. So we have Joe General, who mentions, what makes this a truly Canadian film? Is it subject matter, the approach to it all, the tone? That would have been the same as it was an American production, for instance.
Yes, of course. There are Canadian American films that could be this movie. There are filmmakers in the US who could have made this movie, and there are probably movies we could think of done in the US that are not unsimilar. But for me, and again, I don't know. I've lived in Canada for 20 years, but I didn't grow up here. I can't say I really really deeply understand what Canadian identity is. But to me, again, what I think was unique about this film in terms of its representation is again the use of landscape, and how important in Canada the landscape of our country is, the vastness of the country, that we're just a tiny little group of people mostly living along the border, right, of this huge country. So the evoking that and kind of placing the people as just these tiny little things, against this huge landscape. The sense of isolation, again, some of us live in cities, but many Canadians live in rural areas, quite isolated. The sense of community, very small, tightly knit community. Yeah, that happens in the US too, but I think that's sort of a Canadian phenomenon, because again, if you live in a very cold and and harsh climate, it's important to have human interaction, and communities do have, these small communities do have tight. So, these are the kind of things, again, the characters and some of the particularly Billy, to me, represent a very kind of Canadian, strength and kind of individualism and belief in. So you're absolutely right. This could have been in Sweden. It could have been in the US. It could have been many places. It's not unique to Canada, but for me, it felt, it represented elements of the Canadian story as I understand it, at least.
Carl Feldman, would you agree that the cold and brutal landscape is a character unto itself, perhaps a protagonist?
Very important character. That's a great comment. I completely agree. It's a great character, and again, I think a defining part of Canadian identity was survival against this harsh wilderness, that the original explorers, the settlers, had to deal with. The forest. How did they carve a country and a civilization out of this incredibly harsh world? They weren't going to, they weren't settling Italy. They weren't settling, the southern U.S. or, how do you grow crops? How do you survive? And this is, these are big stories, and we could spend hours talking about Canadian identity and what does that mean. But for me, if I had to say, I chose this film because I felt this represented something that is evocative of my understanding of Canadian identity.
Yeah, marvelous film. So what's up next, Fred?
Well, like I said, next is Away from Her, Sarah Polley. Unbelievable performance by Julie Christie. Fantastic actress. She actually got an Academy Award nomination from this film. And we're going to have a guest, because this is a film about Alzheimer's, about what happens when people start to lose their memories. And we're actually going to bring on a guest to talk to who is a Hamilton woman who's an expert on Alzheimer's and the effect it has on people and the treatment and maybe, you know, be interesting to get her perspective on the film and you know, what might have been, you know, it's based on a fantastic short story by Alice Munro, The Bear Came Over the Mountain. If you'd like to read the short story first before you watch the film, I might suggest that. It won't take you very long. You know, again, Sarah Polley makes it her own. Didn't even use the title, but you know, it's a wonderful, wonderful film. And I think, and again, you know, in the spirit of diversity, we weren't going to do this series without a female director. So Sarah was the one we chose. I mean, there could have been others, but anyhow, thank you all for attending. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Brilliant talk. Thanks, Fred.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Bye-bye.